The Valthrine Empire had ruled over the Orion Arm for 3,000 years, and their crystalline ships moved through space like silent predators that had never known defeat. They had catalogued every species they encountered and conquered every civilization that dared to resist their authority. Their archives contained the histories of 100 fallen races, and the Valthrine believed themselves to be the ultimate power in this region of space. Commander Zekthor stood before the Imperial Council with his 4 eyes gleaming in the dim light of the chamber, and his mandibles clicking together in anticipation. He had come to deliver news that would please the Council and cement his reputation as a decisive military leader. The humans have rejected our terms, and their planet called Earth refuses to submit to Imperial authority. They claim sovereignty over their own star system and have denied our rightful jurisdiction over their space, Commander Zekthor announced with confidence in his voice. The council members clicked their mandibles in response, and the sound echoed through the massive chamber like rainfall on metal. To the Valthrine, this defiance from such a young species was almost amusing in its futility. The humans had barely achieved faster than light travel, and their technology was primitive compared to the vast capabilities of the Empire. They had no significant military fleet, and no allies among the established powers of the galaxy. Their resistance seemed like nothing more than the tantrum of a child who did not understand the reality of their situation. However, there was one voice in the chamber that did not join in the dismissive clicking. Archivist Venza stood near the back of the council room, and her body posture indicated hesitation and concern. She had spent decades in the restricted archives and had seen fragments of information that troubled her deeply. There is a matter worth noting, and in the restricted archives there exists a fragment from the predecessor civilization. Venza spoke carefully and chose her words with precision. It mentions a species matching human characteristics, and the fragment is labeled with a warning. Glyph Commander Zekthor turned his attention toward the archivist, and his expression showed clear irritation at this interruption. The predecessors left warnings about solar flares and unstable wormholes too, and their paranoia does not concern us. We have defeated species far more advanced than these humans, and their primitive weapons cannot harm our ships. He waved one of his lower appendages dismissively, and the gesture indicated that the matter was closed for discussion. The council members murmured their agreement, and Venza felt her concerns being swept aside like dust in the wind. Meanwhile, on Earth, the situation looked very different from the human perspective. Admiral Jake Morrison stood in the command center of the UHSF Defiance, and around him, officers reviewed tactical data with expressions of grim determination on their faces. The command center was a massive room, filled with holographic displays and sensor readings that painted a picture of the approaching threat. Every person in that room understood what was coming, and every person had accepted that they might not survive the next few days. They are coming in fast, and 300 ships, maybe more, Lieutenant Kelly Bradford reported from the sensor station, and her voice remained steady despite the fear that everyone in the room could feel. They will be in firing range in 6 hours. Jake Morrison looked at the holographic display that showed the incoming Valthrine fleet as a cloud of red dots moving toward the blue dot that represented Earth. His jaw tightened, and he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders like a physical force. Then we have 6 hours to show them why humanity does not kneel. Send the signal to all defense platforms and to the Armstrong and Lincoln. This is what we have been preparing for. His voice carried through the command center, and everyone present straightened their backs and returned to their stations with renewed focus. Captain Ryan Hayes received the orders aboard the UHSF Armstrong, and he nodded to himself as he read the tactical briefing on his screen. Beside him, Lieutenant Maya Foster began running final checks on their weapon systems, and the ship hummed with energy as its experimental weapons powered up. The Armstrong was one of humanity's newest warships, and it carried technology that had been developed in desperation over the past decade. Every system on the ship represented countless hours of research and testing, and the hope that human ingenuity could overcome superior numbers and technology. Sir, the odds are not in our favor, Maya said quietly, and stated what everyone already knew. Ryan turned to look at his tactical officer, and his expression was calm despite the situation. They never are, but we are not fighting to win. We are fighting to make them regret ever coming here. His words hung in the air, and Maya understood the meaning behind them. This was not about victory in the traditional sense, but about making the cost of attacking Earth so high that the Valthrine would think twice before threatening humanity again. Back on the Valthrine homeworld, archivist Venza could not shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her core. She returned to the restricted archives despite her orders to leave the matter alone, and accessed the ancient fragment that mentioned humans. The text was partial and damaged by time, but what remained made her blood run cold as she read the words left by a civilization that had vanished thousands of years ago. Species designate human and psychological profile extreme persistence and irrational courage when threatened and capacity for rapid innovation under pressure. The fragment continued with words that seemed to pulse with urgency across the millennia. Recommendation: avoid conflict at all costs, and they do not fight to win, but they fight until nothing remains of either side. The Koresh made the mistake of engaging them, and the consequences were catastrophic. Venza knew about the Koresh from her studies of ancient history. They had been the predecessor's greatest enemy, and a civilization that had nearly conquered the entire galaxy before mysteriously vanishing 12,000 years ago. The historical record showed that the Koresh had possessed technology and military power that made even the current Valthrine Empire look insignificant by comparison. Yet according to this fragment, the humans had been involved in their disappearance somehow. She tried to access more information, but the data corruption was too severe, and whole sections of the warning were simply gone and lost to time. She immediately tried to contact Commander Zekthor, but discovered that the fleet had already entered combat. Range of Earth and communication would be delayed by several hours due to the distance involved. Venza felt panic rising in her chest and sent the message anyway, along with copies of everything she had found in the archives. She could only hope that the commander would read her warning before it was too late, and that the Empire would not repeat the mistakes of civilizations past. The predecessors had tried to warn future generations about the dangers of engaging humanity in warfare, and now their warning sat unread in a dusty archive while the Valthrine fleet prepared to attack. The stage was set for a conflict that would change the balance of power in this region of space forever. The Valthrine fleet emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, and their crystalline ships formed a wall of death that stretched across the darkness of space like a curtain of stars. Their shields shimmered with energy that could withstand the heat of a sun, and their weapons were charged and ready to reduce planets to ash. Commander Zekthor stood on the bridge of his flagship and felt the familiar rush of confidence that came before every easy victory. Transmit the final demand and they will surrender or be reduced to ash, he commanded, and expected to see the humans bow before the might of the Empire within the hour. The response from Earth was not words but action, and every defense platform and every satellite and every ship that humanity had built opened fire simultaneously. The void erupted with weapons fire that should not have been possible for such a young species, and streaks of light crossed the distance between the fleets faster than thought. Lieutenant Commander Lisa Parker sat at her station on Defense Platform Omega-7 and watched her targeting screen light up with confirmed hits. Direct hit on their flagship and shield integrity dropping. She called out and felt a moment of hope surge through her chest. But the celebration was short-lived because the Valthrine shields, though damaged, still held against the barrage. Their return fire was devastating and precise, and 3 defense platforms simply vanished in explosions that lit up the darkness like miniature suns. Lisa gripped her console as her own station shook from a near miss and alarms began blaring throughout the platform. The structure groaned under the stress, and she could hear the sound of metal tearing somewhere in the lower levels. All platforms switched to pattern Delta 9 and make them work for every inch. Admiral Morrison's voice came through the communication system and carried the calm authority that kept everyone focused on their tasks. On the UHSF, Lincoln Captain Greg Santos watched his crew execute evasive maneuvers that would have been considered suicidal just a decade ago. Humanity had learned to fly like they were fighting for their lives because they truly were, and every pilot had accepted that survival was less important than making the enemy pay for every meter of space. Target their formation nodes, and if we can break their coordination, we can pick them apart, Greg ordered, and his weapons officer, Lieutenant Chris Morgan, launched a spread of kinetic missiles without hesitation. Each missile carried enough force to crack a small moon, and they streaked toward the Valthrine line like arrows shot from the bow of an angry god. The alien ships intercepted most of them with point defense systems, but 3 missiles got through the defensive screen and slammed into a Valthrine cruiser with tremendous impact. The cruiser spun off course and its crystalline hull fractured in multiple places as atmosphere vented into space. It was a small victory, but it proved that the Valthrine could bleed and that knowledge spread through the human fleet like wildfire. Commander, Zekthor felt the impact vibrate through his flagship and his four eyes widened in surprise. This was not supposed to happen, and the humans were supposed to be outmatched and overwhelmed by superior technology and numbers. Instead, they fought with a ferocity that defied all tactical logic and refused to acknowledge the reality of their situation. They are not retreating, and they know they cannot win, yet they continue to attack. His tactical officer reported, and confusion was evident in his voice because this behavior made no sense according to Valthrine military doctrine. Then, we will teach them the price of defiance in all ships. Advance and destroy everything. Zekthor snarled and gave the order that would commit his entire fleet to close combat. The Valthrine formation moved forward like a tidal wave of death, and their weapons lit up space with energy beams that could melt through solid rock. The human ships did not retreat, but instead accelerated toward the enemy fleet and closed the distance in a way that seemed insane to the Valthrine commanders who watched in disbelief. The battle intensified into chaos that resembled nothing in the Valthrine tactical manuals. Human ships darted between the larger Valthrine vessels and fired at point-blank range before banking away in maneuvers that pushed their inertial dampeners to the breaking point. Explosions bloomed in the darkness and debris scattered in all directions as ships from both sides took damage. It was not the ordered warfare that the Valthrine were accustomed to, but rather a brawl where desperation and courage mattered more than superior technology. The Defiance Admiral Morrison coordinated the defense with cold precision, and his mind worked through tactical calculations, even as his heart ached for every loss. Every destroyed ship represented hundreds of lives and families that would never see their loved ones again, but every second they held the line was a second for Earth's population to reach the underground shelters. "Sir, the Armstrong is taking heavy fire," Kelly Bradford reported, and her voice carried a note of alarm that made Morrison look at the tactical display with concern. The UHSF Armstrong was surrounded by Valthrine cruisers, and its shields were failing under the concentrated bombardment. Flames vented from multiple hull breaches, and Morrison could see that the ship was dying. "Order them to fall back," he commanded, but Kelly's response made his blood run cold. "They are not responding, sir, and they are ramming." Ryan Hayes sat in his command chair aboard the Armstrong and knew that his ship was finished. The crew had already evacuated to escape pods per his orders, and only he remained on the bridge. He looked at the nearest Valthrine battleship and made a decision that would cost him his life, but might save countless others. The Armstrong turned directly toward the enemy vessel, and Ryan pushed the engines to maximum power. "For Earth," he whispered, and then the Armstrong struck the Valthrine battleship at a significant fraction of light speed. The explosion was visible from the planet's surface, and it burned like a new star for 3 full seconds, before fading into darkness. When the light cleared, both ships were gone and reduced to expanding clouds of superheated gas and twisted metal. 2 more Valthrine vessels had been caught in the blast radius, and their hulls were shattered beyond any hope of repair. The tactical display showed 4 enemy ships eliminated in a single attack, and the cost had been 1 human vessel and 1 brave captain commander. Zekthor stared at the tactical display in disbelief, and his mandibles hung open in shock. They sacrificed an entire ship for a tactical advantage, and what kind of species does this? He asked aloud, but nobody on his bridge had an answer. The Valthrine fought for glory and honor and territory, but they did not throw away lives like this human had done. It was wasteful and illogical and terrifying in its implications. Across the Valthrine homeworld archivist, Venza found another fragment in the ancient databases, and this one made her hands tremble as she read. Human warfare operates on principles that defy conventional cost-benefit analysis, and they will trade 1 life for 1,000 of the enemy without hesitation. They will burn their own worlds before surrendering them and do not engage under any circumstances. She transmitted the message to the fleet immediately, but the communication delay meant it would not arrive for hours, and she feared it was already too late to prevent disaster. The battle raged on for hours, and the space around Earth became a graveyard of broken ships and shattered dreams. Defense platforms fell one by one under Valthrine fire, but each platform took enemy ships with them into oblivion. Human fighters swarmed around Valthrine cruisers like angry insects, and their small size made them difficult targets. while their weapons still packed enough punch to damage critical systems. The Valthrine had superior shields and stronger hulls and better weapons, but the humans had something that could not be measured on tactical displays. They had the absolute refusal to accept defeat and the willingness to pay any price for survival. Every human in that battle knew they were outmatched and probably going to die, but not one of them considered surrender as an option. They fought with the desperation of a species that understood this might be their last stand, and the ferocity of predators defending their young. The Valthrine had fought hundreds of wars and conquered countless worlds, but they had never faced an enemy quite like this. As the battle entered, its second day, Commander Zekthor tallied his losses and felt doubt creeping into his mind for the first time in his military career. 3 days into the battle, the Valthrine Empire had learned a harsh lesson that defeating humans and conquering humans were two entirely different propositions. The human fleet was decimated, and of the 40 ships that had initially defended Earth, only 7 remained operational. Thousands of personnel had died in the cold vacuum of space, and defense platforms lay scattered in ruins across orbital space like the bones of some massive creature. By any conventional measure, humanity should have surrendered hours ago, and yet they fought harder with each passing moment. Commander Zekthor surveyed the wreckage from his flagship, and the vessel was now scarred and damaged. Despite its superior technology, he had lost 90 ships in 3 days, and 90 ships to a species that should not have been able to scratch his paint, according to all tactical projections. The numbers made no sense, and the losses were mounting faster than replacements could arrive from Imperial space. Status of their planet, he demanded, and his voice carried an edge of frustration that his crew had never heard before. Multiple cities destroyed, sir, but their military command structure remains intact, his tactical officer reported while studying the sensor data carefully. They have moved it underground, and our scanners show extensive tunnel networks across all continents that go deeper than our weapons can reach from orbit. The officer paused and then added something that made Zekthor's mandibles click in anger. Every landing party we have sent to the surface has disappeared, sir. Then we will dig them out, Zekthor said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew it was not that simple. Every squad of Valthrine soldiers sent to Earth's surface had vanished, and not defeated in glorious combat, but simply gone without a trace. Some had sent brief distress calls before communication cut off, and others had died in ambushes that seemed to come from nowhere. The humans did not fight with honor, but with tactics that the Valthrine military doctrine had no answer for. On Earth, Lieutenant Colonel Amy Brooks led a resistance cell in what used to be the ruins of Chicago, and her team of 30 soldiers had killed over 300 Valthrine troops in the past week. They used tactics that would have made their ancestors proud, and struck from shadows and used improvised explosives, and fired sniper shots from collapsed buildings before disappearing into the rubble. The Valthrine soldiers were stronger and better armed, but they moved in predictable patterns and never adapted to the guerrilla warfare that humans had perfected over millennia of fighting each other. They are not adapting, and they keep using the same formations and the same patrol routes, Sergeant Danny Porter observed as they watched another Valthrine patrol march through their kill zone. The aliens moved with military precision down the center of what used to be a street, and their weapons were ready, but their eyes never scanned the right places for hidden threats. They have never had to adapt, and every war they have fought has been won with overwhelming force. Amy replied and checked her rifle one more time. They do not know how to fight an enemy that refuses to line up and die properly. She raised her hand, and her team tensed in preparation. On my mark, in 3 and 2 and 1 and mark. The ambush was over in seconds, and the Valthrine patrol was eliminated before they could call for support. Amy's team melted back into the ruins and already moving to their next position through tunnels and subway systems that the aliens did not know existed. Behind them, the bodies of the patrol lay in the street, and another message to the invaders that Earth would not be taken easily. In space, Admiral Morrison was running out of options, and the UHSF Defiance had taken critical damage that made every system groan in protest. His remaining ships were held together more by stubbornness than structural integrity, and the crews were exhausted beyond measure. But they still had one card to play and one desperate gamble that might change the course of the battle. "Status on Project Prometheus," he asked quietly, and his voice barely carried across the ruined bridge. Dr. Helen Carter's face appeared on his screen, and her eyes were bloodshot from 72 hours without sleep. "We are ready, Admiral, but I need to be clear about something." She paused and chose her words carefully. "We have no idea if this will work, and the technology is based on theoretical physics we barely understand. Will it hurt them?" Morrison asked, and that was the only question that mattered at this point. "If it works, then yes, and if it does not work, it might tear a hole in reality," Helen replied with brutal honesty. "I do not know which outcome is more likely, sir." Morrison looked at the tactical display and saw Earth battered but unbroken. He saw the Valthrine fleet still numbering over 200 ships, and he saw his own forces bloodied and exhausted, but still fighting. The choice was simple, even if the consequences were terrifying. "Do it," he said, and gave the order that would either save humanity or destroy everything. On the moon's far side, hidden from Valthrine scanners, the Prometheus device began to charge. It was humanity's last gamble and a weapon that manipulated space and time itself, and turned the very fabric of reality into something that could kill. The device hummed with power that should not have been possible, and energy readings climbed into ranges that made the scientists monitoring. "It feels sick with fear and anticipation. Commander." Zekthor received the energy readings. With alarm, and every sensor on his flagship was screaming warnings about the power signature coming from the human moon. "What is that?" he demanded, and his voice carried real fear for the first time in his long military career. "Unknown, sir, and the power signature is off all our charts." His science officer replied, and his appendages were trembling as he studied the data. "It is coming from their moon, and the energy levels are increasing exponentially. Destroy it, and now." Zekthor shouted, but the Valthrine ships were out of position and scattered by days of hit-and-run attacks. They had spread out to cover more orbital space, and now that tactical decision became a fatal mistake. By the time they began to reorient toward the moon, it was already too late, and the humans had won the race against time. The Prometheus device fired, and space screamed. That was the only way any witness could describe what happened next, and reality itself seemed to bend and twist in ways that should not have been possible. A wave of distorted space and time rippled out from the moon, and every ship caught in its path simply ceased to function. Drives went offline without warning, and shields collapsed like soap bubbles, and weapon systems failed simultaneously. 60 Valthrine ships went dark in an instant, and they drifted in space like dead leaves caught in a current. "Impossible," Zekthor whispered as his own ship's systems flickered and threatened to fail. His science officer was frantically working at his console and trying to understand what had just happened to them. "Sir, they have weaponized dimensional physics." The science officer stammered, and his voice carried disbelief. "We have theorized about this for centuries, but the power requirements alone should have been impossible. For a species at their technological level, they are insane, and that weapon could have destroyed their own planet if it miscalibrated," Zekthor said, and finally understood what he was truly fighting. The humans had built a weapon that could kill them as easily as it could kill their enemies, and they had fired it anyway without hesitation. "Admiral." Morrison watched the effects of the Prometheus device with satisfaction and horror mixing together in his chest. Dr. Carter had warned him that the weapon had a 30% chance of collapsing into a black hole and consuming the entire solar system. Humanity had fired it anyway and gambled with extinction rather than surrender. "That is what you are up against," Morrison transmitted to the Valthrine flagship, and his voice was cold and hard. "We are the species that will gamble with extinction rather than surrender, and we are the species that turns physics into weapons before we fully understand the consequences, and we are just getting started." "Commander." Zekthor looked at his crippled fleet and at the human planet that still defied him, and at the tactical display that showed his once mighty armada reduced to barely more than 100 functional vessels. For the first time in 3,000 years, the Valthrine Empire considered retreat, and the word tasted like ash in Zekthor's mouth, but he could not deny the reality before him. Archivist Venza finally reached Commander Zekthor as he surveyed the crippled remnants of his once mighty fleet. 60 ships drifted dead in space, and another 30 were damaged beyond immediate repair, and his armada was reduced to barely more than 100 functional vessels. The pride of the Valthrine Empire had been humbled by a species that should not have posed any threat, and Zekthor felt something he had never experienced before in his long military career, which was doubt. "Commander, you must see the full archive," Venza transmitted, and her voice carried an urgency that made Zekthor pause despite his desire to ignore her warnings. "I have recovered more of the predecessor warnings, and you need to know what you are facing. Thor was in no mood for ancient history, but something in Venza's tone made him open the transmitted file. The full archive unfolded before him on his display, and with each line his confidence crumbled further like a tower built on sand, finally meeting the tide. Predecessor archive and species analysis, human and catalogued 15,000 cycles before present. The text began in the formal style of ancient scientific documentation. Initial contact established with human civilization in early spaceflight stage and physical characteristics, bipedal and oxygen breathing, and moderate strength and durability, and initial assessment unremarkable. Thor continued reading, and each revision made his mandibles click with growing horror. Revision 1, and after territorial dispute over resource, rich moon humans demonstrated unexpected aggression. Where retreat was logical, they escalated, and conflict intensity analysis suggested emotional, rather than strategic decision-making, and recommendation increase caution level. Revision 2. And human ships lack defensive capabilities compared to Koresh vessels, and however, humans compensate by attacking with overwhelming concentration of force at single points, and casualties deemed acceptable if objectives achieved, and psychological profile update. Extreme goal orientation supersedes survival instinct. Thor felt his blood chill as he read about the Koresh. They had been the predecessor's greatest enemy, and a civilization with technology that made modern empires look primitive. Yet these humans had fought them, and not only survived, but had somehow prevailed. Revision 3, and after loss of their colony world, Kepler 442b humans did not negotiate or surrender as predicted. Instead, they engineered biological weapons specifically targeting Koresh physiology, and deployed weapons despite knowing it would violate all established warfare conventions and 20 million Koresh casualties in 3 weeks, and human moral flexibility regarding warfare creates unpredictable threat matrix. The report continued, and each entry painted a picture of a species that became more dangerous the more desperate they became. Thor read about how the Koresh had deployed planet-killer weapons against human colonies and eliminated 5 entire worlds in an attempt to break human resistance. The predecessors had predicted immediate surrender, but instead the humans had done something unthinkable. Revision 4, and Koresh Empire deployed planet-killer weapons against Earth colony systems and eliminating 5 human worlds, and expected result human surrender, and actual result humans captured Koresh command vessel and extracted intelligence through extreme interrogation methods and located Koresh homeworld. 3 months later, human fleet arrived at Koresh Prime and initiated orbital bombardment, and when ordered to cease fire, human commander stated, "You taught us that worlds can die, and we are quick learners." Thor had to pause in his reading because his hands were shaking. The humans had learned how to destroy planets from their enemies, and then turn that knowledge back on them with ruthless efficiency. The Koresh homeworld had been the center of an empire that spanned hundreds of systems, and the humans had reduced it to ash in retaliation. Revision 5, and Koresh Empire fell after 2-century war with humans, and survivors fled to dark space, and human civilization nearly collapsed from the effort. 70% casualties and economy destroyed, and hundreds of worlds abandoned. Yet they claim victory, and analysis of human psychology suggests they measure success not by what they preserve, but by whether their enemy still exists. The final entry of the archive made Thor understand why the predecessors had vanished from this region of space. Final entry, and the predecessors made peace with humanity at enormous cost, and we ceded 12 systems and provided technological aid for their reconstruction. In exchange, they promised to remain in their local cluster, and this agreement is the only reason our civilization survived, and we abandoned our territorial claims and retreated to preserve our species. Then came the warning that Venza had tried to share days ago, and the warning that might have prevented this entire disaster. Warning to successor civilizations, and do not engage humans unless you are willing to accept total war, and they do not. Surrender, and they do not negotiate from weakness, and they will sacrifice everything. Their worlds, their people, their future to ensure their enemy loses. The Koresh were the greatest military power in galactic history, and humanity reduced them to a footnote through sheer relentless brutality, and if you encounter humans, maintain diplomatic relations at all costs, and if diplomacy fails, retreat, and If retreat is impossible, know that you face a species that evolved by outlasting predators and ice ages and plagues and each other, and they are survivors who learned to thrive through spite. The warning concluded with words that seemed to burn themselves into Zekthor's mind. Do not make our mistakes, and do not assume their compassion is weakness, and do not test their limits, and we barely survived learning these lessons. And you may not. Commander Zekthor felt his entire worldview crumbling as he finished reading. He looked at the tactical display and saw human ships still fighting despite catastrophic damage, and saw the planet below where every landing force had been systematically destroyed. They were not defending their world, and they were teaching us a lesson, he said quietly to himself. His communication officer interrupted his thoughts. Sir, and incoming transmission from Earth. Admiral Morrison's face appeared on the screen, and his uniform was torn and bloodied, and smoke rose from shattered consoles behind him. The human commander looked exhausted, but his eyes blazed with a defiance that Zekthor now understood was the core of human nature. Commander Zekthor, Morrison said, and his voice was calm despite the chaos visible behind him. You have lost a third of your fleet, and you have accomplished nothing except proving that we can hurt you. So here is what happens next, and you can continue this war. And maybe you will eventually destroy Earth. But we have already seeded colony ships with our full knowledge base to a dozen systems you will never find, and humanity will survive. And we will spend the next 1,000 years building weapons for the sole purpose of destroying your empire. Morrison paused and let his words sink in before continuing. Every species you have conquered will hear about how a primitive race bloodied the mighty Valthrine, and they will rebel, and your empire will fall, and maybe not today, but we will make sure it happens. Zekthor wanted to respond, but Morrison held up his hand. Or you can leave and right now, and we will call this a misunderstanding, and we will stay in our corner of space, and you stay in yours. And nobody has to learn what humans are really capable of when we stop holding back. Holding back. Zekthor could not help but ask. You have sacrificed half your military and multiple cities. Morrison smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression, but rather the smile of a predator that had been playing with its food. Commander, we have 5 billion people on Earth, and every single one of them knows how to make explosives from household chemicals, and we have been killing each other for 10,000 years over gods and resources and insults, and we got very, very good at it. What you have seen is us being restrained, because some of us still hope for peace, and if you want to see what we are like when we stop hoping, then by all means, continue the war. On the Defiance Bridge, Kelly Bradford monitored the sensors and watched the power readings from weapon systems that humanity had not yet deployed. Should I tell him about the antimatter stockpile? She asked quietly. Morrison shook his head slightly and let them wonder, and let them imagine what else humanity had prepared in the years since first contact. Zekthor looked at the archive and at his crippled fleet, and at the human commander who spoke of atrocities as casually as discussing the weather. And he made the hardest decision of his life. We will withdraw, and but know this, human. If your kind ever leaves your designated space, the full might of the Empire will return. Fair enough, Morrison replied, and his expression did not change. And you know this, Valthrine, and if you ever come back here, we will not settle for just bloodying you next time. The transmission ended, and Zekthor gave the order to retreat, and the Valthrine fleet began its withdrawal, leaving behind the wreckage of their hubris and their shattered confidence. The Valthrine fleet disappeared into hyperspace, and Earth waited in silence for 3 hours while everyone held their breath and half expected the alien ships to return. When the sensors finally confirmed they were truly gone, Admiral Morrison allowed himself to collapse into his command chair and felt the weight of 3 days of constant battle finally catch up to him. His body ached and his mind was foggy with exhaustion, but the war was over, and humanity had survived. Status report, he said quietly, and his voice was hoarse from shouting orders over the sound of explosions and alarms. Kelly Bradford's voice was hollow as she read the numbers that would haunt them all for years to come. 33 ships lost with all hands, and 7 ships heavily damaged but salvageable, and 14 defense platforms destroyed, and estimated military casualties 42,000. She paused and took a breath before continuing. Civilian casualties from orbital bombardment 1.3 million in Chicago and Seattle and Mumbai and Lagos are gone, and Berlin and Tokyo are heavily damaged. The Bridge was silent, and victory, if it could be called that, had a terrible weight that pressed down on everyone present. They had won, but the cost made the word victory feel hollow and meaningless. Morrison closed his eyes and thought about the families who would never see their loved ones again, and the children who had been orphaned, and the cities that would take decades to rebuild. On Earth's surface, Lieutenant Colonel Amy Brooks stood in what used to be downtown Chicago and watched the sun rise through a haze of smoke and dust that still hung in the air. Her team had survived, but she knew dozens of other resistance cells had not been as lucky. The city around her was a graveyard of twisted metal and collapsed buildings, and the silence was broken only by the occasional sound of something settling or falling in the ruins. Was it worth it? Sergeant Danny Porter asked quietly as he stood beside her and looked at the devastation. Amy was quiet for a long moment and considered the question carefully. Ask me in 100 years, and if humanity is still free and if we are still making our own choices, then yes. If we are slaves to some alien empire because we surrendered, then no. She turned to him and her face was streaked with dirt and dried blood. All I know is we did what humans always do and we survived. In the ruins of the Pentagon's underground command center, civilian leaders were already arguing about what came next. President Linda Hayes had spent the entire war in a bunker, coordinating evacuation efforts, and now she listened to the military advisors and politicians debate with growing frustration. The room was packed with people who all had different ideas about how humanity should move forward, and the arguments were becoming heated. We need to rebuild the fleet immediately, General Carl Bennett argued and slammed his fist on the table. The Valthrine could return and we need to be ready. We need to rebuild our cities, Senator Frank Garrett countered, and his voice rose in anger. Over 1 million people are dead and millions more are homeless, and you want to spend our resources on more weapons. We need both, President Hayes said firmly, and her voice cut through the arguing like a knife. And we need something else, and we need to make sure this never happens again. She looked at each person in the room, and her expression left no room for debate. Admiral Morrison bought us breathing room, but that warning about staying in our space is not a peace treaty, and that is a prisoner telling us which cell is ours. She stood up and placed her hands on the table and leaned forward. We are going to rebuild, and we are going to research, and we are going to prepare. The next time someone comes to our solar system and demands we kneel, we will not just bloody them, and we will make sure they never threaten anyone again. In space, Dr. Helen Carter supervised the shutdown of the Prometheus device, and her hands were still shaking from the adrenaline and fear of what they had done. The weapon had worked, but barely, and the calculations showed they had been within 2% of creating a catastrophic dimensional collapse. 2% away from destroying everything in a 5-light-year radius and killing not just Earth but every system nearby. We are insane, her assistant Dr. Kevin Walsh said as he reviewed the data. We actually fired this thing, we are human, Helen corrected and looked at him with tired eyes. When someone threatens extinction, we threaten it right back, and even if it means risking everything. She looked at the scarred surface of Earth visible through the viewport. Now we need to make sure the next version does not have that risk, and because there will be a next version, across human-controlled space colony worlds received the news of Earth's survival with celebration and grim determination. They had all been preparing for the possibility that Earth might fall and that they would become the last remnants of humanity. Now they knew the species had survived, and it had survived by making the aggressors regret their choice to attack. On the frontier colony of New Hope, Governor Steve Patterson addressed the colonists in the main square. Earth held and our homeworld faced the fire and came through, but this was just one battle, and out there in the galaxy are thousands of civilizations. Some might be friendly and others will see us as prey. He paused and looked at the faces of the people who had chosen to leave Earth and build new lives among the stars. So we build and we prepare and we make sure that anyone who thinks humans are easy targets learns the same lesson the Valthrine did, and we do not fight fair and we do not fight clean, and we do not stop fighting until our enemy does. The colonists cheered, and Patterson felt the weight of what humanity had become. They were not the peaceful explorers they had imagined themselves to be when they first reached for the stars. They were survivors who had learned that the galaxy was hostile, and they had adapted the only way humans knew how, by becoming the thing predators feared. On the Valthrine, homeworld archivist Venza presented her findings to the Imperial Council, and the chamber, which had once echoed with confidence, now filled with uncertain silence. The humans are everything the predecessors warned about, she concluded, and her voice carried the weight of historical truth. They are not exceptionally strong or fast, and their technology is crude compared to ours. But they possess something we cannot quantify or counter, and they simply refuse to accept defeat. Council member Thexval, who was one of the Empire's oldest and wisest, spoke carefully. Then we must ensure we never give them reason to leave their space, and we will mark their systems as forbidden territory, and any ship that enters human space does so against Imperial law. We are afraid of them, another council member said, and the words carried shame. The Empire afraid of a species that could not destroy even half our fleet. No, Thexval corrected, and his voice was firm. We are being smart, and the Koresh were not afraid of the humans either, and where are they now? Back on Earth, Admiral Morrison stood in a cemetery in what used to be the suburbs of Washington. Row after row of graves stretched before him, and each one represented someone who had died defending their world. He found the grave he was looking for, and it belonged to Captain Ryan Hayes, who had sacrificed himself and his ship to destroy a Valthrine battleship. We held, Morrison said quietly to the headstone. You bought us the time we needed, and we held, and I hope that means something, and I hope it was worth it. He knew it was a question humanity would be asking itself for generations. They had survived, but at a cost that would echo through their civilization for centuries. They had proven they could fight off an empire, but in doing so they had revealed themselves to a galaxy that now knew humanity was dangerous. Morrison walked away from the cemetery. He thought about the predecessor warning that had tried to save the Valthrine from their own hubris. How many other civilizations out there had similar warnings, and how many species looked at humanity with fear now? Maybe that was the price of survival in a hostile galaxy. You could not be both safe and harmless, and humanity had chosen safety, and the galaxy would remember. On the Defiance, now in orbital, dock for extensive repairs, Kelly. Bradford discovered something in the final analysis of the battle. She brought it to Morrison immediately. Sir, I have been reviewing the Valthrine retreat, and they did not just leave, and they broadcasted on all frequencies as they went, and it was a warning to every species in this spiral, armed to avoid human space. Morrison absorbed this information. They are telling everyone we are dangerous. Yes, sir, and is that a bad thing? Kelly asked. Morrison looked at Earth through the viewport and saw the scars visible even from orbit, and saw the lights of cities that had survived and those that were just memories now. I do not know, he admitted. But it is what we are now, and the galaxy wanted to know what happens when you threaten humanity, and the Valthrine just sent them the answer. And in the depths of space, that answer spread from civilization to civilization, and a warning that would endure for millennia. There is a species young and reckless in the outer rim, and they call themselves humans. And do not threaten them, and do not attack them, and for they do not fight like civilized beings, and they fight like the universe owes them victory, and they will tear down reality itself rather than admit defeat. The predecessors tried to warn us, and the Koresh learned too late, and the Valthrine barely escaped and let their mistake be the lesson we all remember.